.NET Aspire Architecture with Mitch Denny.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies that are building mission-critical software systems. Quick announcement, we're in the second year of my architect forums. Signups for the next session are up, and you can find the link in the show notes as well. And if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with other peers that are also leading .NET software teams, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And through popular demand, we're actually launching an executive software leadership forum. So if you're a director or VP or CTO and you have software teams in your organization and you're in the accountability chain, then that forum would be for you. And so we have those two opportunities. And of course, for those who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. Well, my guest today on the show is Mitch Denny. Mitch is a principal software engineer on the .NET Cloud team working on .NET Aspire and ASP.NET Core. And previously, Mitch has worked on Azure Services and the Azure SDK team and Azure DevOps. And prior to joining Microsoft, he was also a Microsoft MVP. So Mitch, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me along. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. I want to kind of dive into .NET Aspire. You're doing tons of work, but before I do, just so the listeners, maybe some of the listeners who are not on the community stand-ups and other avenues and seen you already can get a sense of your expertise. Back us up a little bit. What are the key things that have happened in your career along the way that maybe steered you towards Microsoft and then the Aspire team within Microsoft?
Yeah, well, I have been in the Microsoft ecosystem for a long time. In fact, probably most of my career. And I was, I started using .NET at the very beginning. In fact, I remember downloading versions of .NET back when it was called the Next Generation Windows Services, in the very early alpha days. And so I climbed onto the .NET bandwagon way back.
That was 2000 or 99, roughly?
I think it was late 99 when I got my hands on a build.
Yeah.
And then, I got involved in user groups and that kind of thing. I think that's ultimately how I ended up becoming an MVP. And that sort of drew me more into the ecosystem. And around late 2015, I decided that it was time to go and work for Microsoft. I feel like I'd been in the ecosystem for a while, and I thought, okay, I want to go and work on the products. And at that time, my speciality was Azure DevOps and that kind of part of the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined the Azure DevOps org, specifically working on 1ES, which is like the internal engineering system at Microsoft. So I helped work with a bunch of internal teams around the engineering systems adoption of Azure DevOps at the time. And I was living in the States when I joined Microsoft. And then my wife had an opportunity to come back to Australia. So I jumped teams and worked on the Azure SDK for a while. And that's a fairly large surface area, as you can imagine.
Yes, that's an understatement.
And then did some work on an Azure Service team, and then ended up on the .NET team, working on ASP.NET Core and more recently .NET Aspire.
That's a lot of different teams. You've seen quite a bit and how it all fits together.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things at Microsoft. You can move around a little bit and sample various things. And, I was always kind of working on things which were kind of key to my interest area in terms of that sort of, how do you help developers be productive and build applications? And so I kind of feel like my collective experience has actually come in pretty handy working on .NET Aspire.
Yeah. Well, it's culmination of so many things, and you've done almost everything with .NET since before it was called .NET. So it's great to bring that experience to bear.
Yeah, although one of the funny things about working on the .NET team is you just realize how much more you've got to learn. So.
Right. Well, the Microsoft Build Conference was at the time of this recording just a couple months back, and Aspire was put out in GA, version 1 of Aspire. But besides just the announcement videos, lots of developers are trying to figure out, okay, what should I do? I have existing .NET applications, and so since you're so deep into it, I hope you could demystify the architecture. So many pieces moving around, the developer CLI and Bicep, and then what exactly is new that makes it .NET Aspire versus just .NET 8?
Yeah, so it's funny on the team we have this kind of running joke around how do we tell people what .NET Aspire is. It's one of these things that's really hard to explain. I'm going to test out something with you here in terms of explaining it. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and if you look at .NET up until now, we've very much been focused on improving that developer experience inside the one process. What's the best way to build a web API? What's the best way to build the user interface? And we've provided APIs that then allow those applications to talk across the network, but we don't necessarily go much beyond that in terms of how you stitch things together. And so I think one way to think of .NET Aspire is it focuses on the seams in between your application components. It focuses on bringing those components together in a more seamless way and make the developer more productive in that area. So it does that in a couple of different ways. It does that with, the first thing that most people see is the dashboard. So you launch an Aspire application, this dashboard pops up and it shows all your components and the telemetry and how things are linked together. It does that in the application model, in the app host. When you build an Aspire application, it allows you to really clearly see in code all of the components and how they link together. And then it also helps you within the applications consuming those interdependencies. And so for me, .NET Aspire is more about focusing on those gaps in between your application components, just to make it so that when you can clone down your repo, hit F5 and you're productive straight away. And that's really something I really enjoy about Aspire, is that sort of, that getting started experience. When someone joins the team, they can just hit go and it's provisioning all of the resources and you don't have to worry about all the configuration and stuff all the time.
So when you say provision all the resources, to what extent does it require anything in Azure versus 100% local?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we've been fairly careful in the design of .NET Aspire to make sure that the core of Aspire itself is cloud agnostic. So if you look at some of the core libraries like Azure Hosting, for example, you won't see any Azure dependencies there. And we reached out to other cloud providers early on to say, hey, would you like to collaborate on this? And AWS has come through and collaborated as well, and they're progressing on their Aspire support. But totally ignoring sort of public cloud providers, when you hit F5 on an Aspire solution, it's really spinning up containers and processes, and those containers can be your dependencies. And so there's a community tool called Aspirate, which allows you to take an Aspire application, deploy it to either Docker Compose or a Kubernetes cluster. So you don't have to use the cloud at all.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if cloud resources are useful to you, then you can use them. And we try to make that easy.
So with your problem statement that you stated, one thing that's always been difficult that I, had to put a lot of effort in all the time is starting things up, and how it just seemed to be that whatever the user interface project was also had the responsibility to start up that application, like a dual responsibility.
Yep.
And if you have the responsibility to start up the application, then you have to have a reference to all of these libraries that you don't want your UI code to even know about. And then you've got that conundrum where, okay, so now it's easy to accidentally bind it to the UI. What part of that does Aspire alleviate?
Yeah, so one of the, I guess, the big innovations I think in Aspire is that we introduced this project called an app host, and it's ultimately just a console application. But what we do in the app host is we allow the developer to describe all of the other application components that they have in their solution. So all of the other processes that they want to launch. And when you run the app host, what we do is we launch the dashboard, but we also launch this other thing behind the scenes called what we call DCP. And it's a
what does that stand for?
It stands for Developer Control Plane. I think it's probably got another official name, but I just call it based on the process name. So we just call it DCP.
Okay.
And so the Aspire app host talks to DCP, and DCP helps us coordinate between Docker running on your local machine and Visual Studio. So for example, when we say to DCP, hey, launch this .NET project, it will talk to Visual Studio on our behalf and say, launch this project and attach the debugger. And so you can have this single project that now launches other projects and gets the debugger attached. And so it makes this sort of nice seamless experience. And I think that's kind of like one of the key innovations in terms of the app host within .NET. It's kind of like in fact, it's funny, when I first started on the project, I was skeptical. And so I said, well, what are we providing that's more than multi-start projects inside Visual Studio? And as we started layering in the capabilities into that model, and you started to be able to more concisely describe the dependencies between components, that's when I became kind of a convert. This is more than multi-start projects. This is a completely new way of starting projects where you describe your interdependencies. Mm-hmm. And then we do some magic with, if your IDE supports it, attaching the debugger and so on.
Okay. So one of the most common architectures that everybody seems to have, regardless of adding more stuff, is a web UI is so common. So a web project. And then some type of data access with SQL Server, which is the most common. So that's, boom, entity framework. And then some core library. And then they got other stuff. But everybody seems to have that core. It's like, okay, got a data access project, got a web project, and I have a library in between the core project. So with Aspire, what's different for, let's say, an application with just that simple structure?
So if you think about that simple application, often you'll have web front end, your API and some sort of worker process. And then you've got your, your stateful dependencies like databases and message queues. The immediate problem that you need to solve when you build an application like that is all of the configuration necessary to, make that worker be able to talk to the message queue and the database, and make the front end be able to talk to the message queue and the database. And so there's all these connection strings and configuration information that needs to flow between them. So what we do with Aspire is, because we control spinning up the database server and the RabbitMQ instance, if you're using that, we know what the connection strings are. And so we automatically inject that configuration information into the processes that we're launching. And the Aspire components within those processes know how to take those connection strings and correctly wire up dependency injection. So we've kind of got like this cross-process hookup model, which I think is quite valuable. And then inside the process, we've got these libraries that streamline hooking up, what people generally want to do with dependencies, which is expose them via dependency injection. What we don't try to do with the Aspire libraries is we don't try to replace existing libraries, whether they're from Microsoft or open source contributors. Aspire is not trying to build its own RabbitMQ client. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is take the RabbitMQ client and make sure it's correctly configured in DI and it's wired up for things like telemetry and so on.
So am I thinking about it properly? With the app host, that's the startup project. Does that mean that the little bit of code that puts in a concrete implementation for an interface into the services, the service collection, that code is in the app host project now instead of maybe the web project?
It's actually both. So we actually have, within this Aspire model, we have kind of two kinds of packages. We have what we call hosting packages, and hosting packages are all about declaring that external dependency. So we have like a aspire.hosting.redis package, and it contains extension methods and types. So you can, in your app host, go, build a .add Redis. And that takes care of describing the Redis dependency in terms of it being a container and what connection string information it exposes. And then you reference that Redis resource in your API project, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then inside your API project codebase, there's an Aspire Stack Exchange Redis package that you can reference, which references the standard Stack Exchange package. So we're not replacing that.
Just a wrapper.
Yeah, that's right. And all it does is it gives you a method that you can go, add Redis output caching or whatever you want to do. And it makes sure that that's correctly configured in DI. So it's kind of both. You've got a package that exists in the Outpost, and you've got a package which exists in the service project. The reason that they're not the same is that we were concerned that, if you think about a microservice application, you've got lots of different components you want to use, and we were a little bit concerned about dependency socialization between them. Because if we made it the same package, then all of those dependencies for all of the things you depend on across your entire application would then have to be a dependency inside the app host, and we thought that might create some friction. It's a topic of debate at the moment as to whether we change that, and the reason is that there are some benefits of being able to execute client logic in the app host for initialization. So we're trying to work through some of that stuff at the moment.
So it sounds like it is true that the web project, whereas before I might have had to reference Redis directly or Entity Framework directly just to wire up the IOC container. Now that web project doesn't even have to have a reference at all to Redis or Entity Framework. Is that true?
Well, so what we try to do is make it so that you can add an Aspire let's take Entity Framework, for example. So you might have the Entity Framework libraries for SQL. So there would be an aspire.microsoft.blah Entity Framework library for SQL.
Mm-hmm.
You just add the reference to that one package, and its transitive dependencies include Entity Framework. So there's only one package to add, and that one package gives you an extension method for DI, which allows you to say, hey, add, in the case of EF, you add an EF context to your DI, and you just tell it the name of the Aspire resource from the app host.
Mm-hmm.
It takes care of everything else. Now, if you're in kind of like a brownfields scenario where you've already got some service code, you might have all that stuff wired up already. And so for a lot of these packages, we also have this kind of enrichment method where you can say, look, I've already got an EF context configured, but I want the extra Aspire goodness around telemetry and so on. And so we kind of allow people to sort of approach it from both angles.
Yeah. So you mentioned Docker and Kubernetes. Is it a base assumption that what's deployed is going to be packaged up as a container, or does this also work for just applications that are pushed to app service that are not containerized? How tight is that assumption?
It's a good question. So we tend to assume that the applications are going to be containerized in some fashion, and at least for the Azure side of the story, reminding that this is the core of Aspire itself is cloud agnostic, but we do have extensions for Azure, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
We've provided a really well-paved path to Azure Container Apps. We are looking at other compute models as well. So there's some work going on right now around how do we describe how to deploy a particular project on, say, app service or functions or so on. There's lots of moving parts in that we've got to figure out, but they're things that are of active interest to us right now. We're trying to figure it out.
Okay. So while there's not a blocker to just, taking that what's produced in the solution and put into app service, the best supported path right now is Azure App Service with the Docker containers.
Azure Container Apps.
Azure Container Apps. You're right. I misspoke.
We've got so many compute
That's right.
options.
Container apps.
Yeah, that's correct. And just keep in mind that the tools like AZD and Aspirate, they know how to take the manifest for an Aspire application and do the deployment. But fundamentally, an Aspire-based application is just some .NET apps and its dependencies. And so you can manually go and deploy an Aspire application. But what we've tried to do with the manifest is really concisely describe all of the various configuration values to make the application. So you could look at the manifest and use that kind of like an instruction manual for how to go and manually configure your services if you wanted to.
Yeah. So what changes, and you're on the Azure DevOps team, what changes when you're putting together the pipeline? Where before, okay, we build something and then we package up the web in a NuGet package, throw it in Azure Artifacts, and we package up, I don't know, the side process that just reads from a queue or something. And okay, now it's a worker process, boom, another NuGet package in Azure Artifacts. So we get container images instead of NuGet packages for deployment. And what changes from the integration build to, the first line test deployment because we're using Aspire?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
I think, DevOps folks will always want to kind of peel back the label a bit and look what's underneath. But the sort of like the easy mode for .NET Aspire. Easy mode for .NET Aspire is that you have a deployment pipeline where you basically in your CI pipeline you go AZD up or AZD deploy or AZD provision. So there's I don't know how familiar you are with AZD.
Yeah.
But with AZD, you can spin up an entirely new environment. So what you would do is you would define your environments within your pipeline, and then inside your pipeline jobs, assuming Azure pipelines, you would basically issue an AZD up command for each environment as you roll through your environment. And what happens with AZD is it looks for its Azure YAML file, which would be in your repo, and it says, okay, well, here is the app host. It actually executes the app host as part of your CI/CD pipeline, but it executes it in sort of like publisher mode. And what AZD will do, what the Aspire app host will do is spit out this JSON file. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, but this JSON file is kind of like a list of all of the resources in the app host and all of the, like an expression language for linking all of the things together. And AZD processes that and picks up a bunch of bicep files that we've also dropped on the disk, and then does the actual deployment. And so that's kind of like the easy mode. It is possible with AZD to say AZD infra synth, and what you do in that case is it spits out all of the bicep files, kind of like on your local developer machine, and you can check those files in and you can customize those files. But obviously at that point, you've kind of ejected out of the automatic code generation that we've done for you. So if you add resources, you might need to do that again and deal with the diff.
I think everybody wants the easy mode. And there's just tons of automation that everyone has done already who have done automated deployments through a series of multiple environments. And now it's like, wow, there's an easy mode? Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of where my I was very big into pipeline automation, all that kind of stuff, obviously from my DevOps background, and I have a lot of empathy for people that want to know really precisely what's being deployed with their application. So one of the things I say to people is that you can actually have both, right? So you can make it so that when you deploy your application, so when you submit a pull request, part of your PR process is you go AZD Infra Synth and you compare it to a baseline. So your infrastructure guys that are approving PRs can actually say, well, what's defined has changed from the baseline. Do we accept that?
Yeah.
And if it's changed, developers have to go back and just reset the baseline. But once you get past that PR process, just use easy mode, right?
Okay, so
just keep it simple.
I think the most simple scenario, 3 environments. Of course, you got production at the end, then a manual test environment, and then a dev test environment where you're just going to run like automated tests. I need to deploy it here somewhere so I can run Selenium or Playwright tests, and everything's got to be deployed. So 3 environments. Which commands are suitable for each of those 3 types of deployed environments?
Well, actually, it's the same command in all environments. So, and it's really just like as if you were running it locally on your machine. So if I've got an app host on my local machine, and I want to stand up an environment that's based on what's in that app host, I go AZD init, and that does some initial configuration in terms of selecting app host, but it's very minimal. Then when I want to deploy the actual new environment, I use this command AZD up. And AZD up says, hey, you don't have an environment defined, so let's create a new one. So you give your environment a name and you provide some parameters. And then it will then go ahead and deploy that environment. And if you've already deployed that environment, it will only deploy the Delta. So really what you're doing in the context of CI is exactly the same thing. You've already run AZD init, that file's checked into your repo, but you're providing environment variables and configuration for each specific environment that you're deploying to. So AZD has a mechanism where you can provide the environment variables specific to that environment from the pipeline environment. And so you're really just going AZD up in each environment. Mm-hmm. Now, in test environments, sometimes people want to sort of build the environment and then tear it down after some predetermined period of time. And so AZD actually also has a down command. You need to use the AZD down command, or you could just go and execute a command to yoink the resource group from underneath it, depending on how destructive you want to be.
Well, and that seems to be pretty common. Like with that test environment for Playwright or Selenium tests, once we run the tests, we don't even care about that whole resource group if we deployed it, everything in there.
Just delete it, right?
So, okay, so when we see AZD up, we're passing it in the app host, right? The path to the app host.
Yeah, so that when you execute AZD up, it looks for the Azure YAML file. The Azure YAML file tells you where the app host is. Okay. And it executes the app host in sort of publisher mode.
So connect us with the build and the first time that we do AZD up. What does the set of release candidates look like in this world? If I'm am I still using Azure Artifacts, or now because I have containers, I need to put them in Azure Container Registry? What is that bridge? What are the actual files that the build now needs to produce in this world?
So really, there's actually not anything. So in your CI/CD pipeline, often you sort of build your app host. So if you think about the way that you traditionally build and deploy a solution without a spy, you might build a set of binaries in the CI stage, and then you just copy those binaries down in your CD stage and somehow deploy them to your compute. Yeah, exactly. With the combination of Aspire and AZD, you don't really worry about that. So in your CD pipeline, you clone down the specific version of source that you're using, and AZD will actually take care of running the publish command on the .NET projects to generate the containers for you and uploading them to ACA. So part of the AZD deployment is it will generate an ACR instance.
ACR, the registry.
Azure Container Registry. So many A-based acronyms. Occupational hazard. It will take care of creating those container images and publishing them for you as part of the continuous deployment pipeline. So the implication there is that you are rebuilding the source in the continuous deployment stage of the pipeline, which might seem kind of odd for sort of traditional DevOps kind of folks, but it's just the way that AZD kind of works. There's not like a pre-built artifact that you carry from your CI stage to your CD stage.
So if it calls .NET Publish and now you have some set of files in the published directory, right?
Yep.
Can we still stick to the build once, deploy many pattern by saving what was generated in the published directory as a zip file or NuGet package?
Not really with AZD. If you want to build that all out manually, yes, you can. So you can. There's no reason why you can't have your own bicep files that you deploy and generate your container images earlier. It really just comes down to how much you want us to do it for you versus sort of roll your own solution.
Okay. But the container images get pushed to the Azure Container Registry.
That's right.
Or do they get regenerated right before you deploy to production as well?
They get regenerated right before you deploy to production as well, but it should be off the same source baseline. So all of your dependencies should be the same. So unless there's something weird going on in the compiler, it should basically be the same code.
Got it. Okay. And then one big different, variables. There's a lot of years of just variables being pushed into JSON files. Is it because we're going to now Azure Container Apps, all those variables are now environment variables, right? Or are there still some that get poked into JSON files somewhere along the way?
So we went out of our way to avoid putting a secret in any JSON file. So when you use AZD and you generate the manifest itself, unless you've actively tried to shoot yourself in your foot, it won't contain a secret. The way it works is inside the app model, if you've got like a configuration value there might be something that you change per environment. It might even be a secret. You can add a parameter or add a connection string, and we treat that as like an empty slot. And when you go and deploy into a particular environment, we kind of prompt for that value, or you supply it via the environment. And when you deploy, those values are then punched into the container app. So we use, there's like a secrets mechanism inside ACA for storing that stuff, and they can also be linked to key vaults. So let's say that you're using Azure Postgres as a data store, and it has a connection string because it doesn't currently have a GA version with managed identity support. So there's a connection string, which is a secret you should be carefully keeping track of. At deployment time, we'll create a key vault. We'll put the connection string in key vault, and then AZD will take care of referencing that secret from the key vault into the ACA application for you. So if you think about all the things that you got to think about when you're building your own deployment, we've tried to make it as sensible as possible.
Those are a lot of steps, and it's just so many things to do right and keep from unnecessarily exposing multiple people to those secrets just by the way it was managed. Even if it was encrypted as a variable, well, if we're going to push it into configuration for an Azure container app, well, if I have access to go look at that resource in Azure, I can also peek at the environment variables, and boom, there I'm looking at it.
Yeah, so obviously you've got to think about who's got access to those environments anyway. Like even when we deploy the Azure resources, there's a managed identity that the container apps run under, and they're the things that have access to key vaults and so on. So there's a kind of, we've made some assumptions around the security model. Yeah. Some of the work we're doing at the moment is related to supporting more different compute environments as well, is allowing greater flexibility in how those individual container apps are configured, even down to changing the managed identities that you use.
Okay.
But it's a journey. We've got some dependencies that we're working through.
So if we've got easy mode and just I've got a simple web application and some backend job, okay, they're going to end up being run as a container in Azure Container Apps. But Azure Container Apps has all these other knobs and where I can auto scale up and down. How much of that configuration is supported, or versus okay, now after this, in order to get the goodness, I've got to still do stuff on the side?
Yeah, so at the moment, there's kind of a cliff, which we're trying to smooth a little bit more. So one of the things we're working on at the moment is how do we allow more customization of the individual container app around scaling options and so on. That is a really high priority for us. But if you can't wait for us to sort of provide that sort of more subtle step, you can do an AZD infra synth, and in that case, you've got your bicep, and you can go and tweak those scaling values directly if you want to. And so that's kind of like you're using Aspire and AZD in that case to bootstrap the manual effort that you would have to be doing yourself. So you can sort of like we'll drop everything down on disk as if we would have generated it at deployment time.
Yeah.
And then you can tweak it from there.
Okay. Parts of our industry, people are talking about GitOps and having a different Git repository for, other configurations of the cloud or if they're using Kubernetes, whatever the environments are. Does that have any intersection with some of the things that you've pulled into Aspire or the Azure Developer CLI and how it works? Or is that a totally different concept without overlap?
I think when you're deploying an Aspire application, you're really talking the sort of core infrastructure pieces of your app. I think GitOps is kind of interesting because GitOps can obviously target those parts of your solution as well. But where I see a lot of people using GitOps is more sort of broader configuration options for a system. So not the core application components themselves, but the configuration of the application. And so there's nothing in in Aspire and AZD that stops you having a separate repo where you have a bunch of config values inside Git, which then have a pipeline that then say applies at say Azure App Config. So you could have Azure App Config as the dependency of your Aspire application, and you read down those config values at runtime. But you could have a completely separate GitOps process that affects populating that config store. It really just depends on how you want to structure your environment. The thing about GitOps is that it's you've got to be a little bit careful with it as well in terms of like you don't put secrets in there anyway, so you've got to have a separate process for secret management. I think it's generally a good thing if used wisely, but Aspire itself doesn't necessarily do anything special with GitOps.
Okay. All these new things, I'm wondering, what's the Venn diagram look like? Because people all over the place are getting creative and coming up with, interesting new patterns and testing them out. So,
yep.
And with Aspire being, so new, again, GA just at the Build conference, for people who really want to dig in, what are the best resources right now where they can see like the best samples or working instances? Where's the best ones that you could point people to at this point in time?
So I think there's three things that I would say for people. They should go and check out the official Learn docs. We are somewhat unusual in that we had a lot of docs when we launched Aspire. They can always be better. We're always trying to improve it. In fact, it's like one of our number one things for the 8.1 release is continuing to hone our docs. So that's on the learn.microsoft.com site. There's like, if you search for Aspire docs, you'll find it. I would also recommend looking at the Aspire samples repo. So there's a github.com/.net/aspire-samples. That's a great way of sort of looking at really quite simple code on how to just get something working. And then we've also got the eShop example, which is a more comprehensive sample. They're the kind of three things that I would point people at.
Okay. It's always a little bit tricky showing code and then, expecting some people to be able to clone the repository, hit the button, and, wasn't this supposed to create a bunch of stuff in my Azure repo? Why doesn't it work?
Yeah, in fact, we've done fairly well. The only if let's say I have a repo that has an Aspire project, and let's say it doesn't have any Azure dependencies, it's just using the stock standard Aspire, add Redis, add Postgres, add SQL, whatever. Most people should be able to clone those repos, hit F5, and it just runs, unless people have sort of gone out of their way to make it more involved. And that's been really quite useful for our bug management inside Aspire. It's quite easy. Hey, can you create a repro and a GitHub repo, and we'll just clone it down and hit F5, and we'll see what's going on. Once you start dealing with cloud deployment, you've obviously got to deal with, what subscription am I targeting? What credentials am I using? And so inside Visual Studio, at least, if you open up the app host, there's like a connected services icon underneath the project. you right mouse click on that, and you can add the Azure provisioning settings, and you just provide your subscription details. And so if you're using Azure resources and you hit F5, it should then go and create those resources in the cloud for you.
Nice.
So we've tried to make it pretty simple. We've got some ideas for making it even simpler.
And I think
that's where we are right now.
When you talk about the easy mode, I think that every developer, that's what they want to do the first time is, okay, clone a repository. I've got my, Visual Studio subscription, Azure with my $150 a month. Okay, that's my playground.
Yep.
Let me put in my details. Go, pray. Okay, did it work? I mean, that's that's really what they want.
It's funny. We have this. We have a set of Azure subscriptions inside Microsoft. Obviously, we've all got our Azure subscriptions that we use, and we've got this one that we were using, which is like the R&D subscription for the team, and it's just like everyone was targeting it. So we just had this like explosion of Azure resources that we were creating in there for testing. But the nice thing is that every single Aspire deployment kind of has its own resource group. And so it's really easy just to go through and clean those things up. Yeah. Whether you're using AZD or you're using just F5 directly, it's quite straightforward.
For sure.
It's one of the nice things actually is that our kind of default deployment model is keep everything self-contained and tidy.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap, final question, and I know that cloud agnostic, but come on, Microsoft is Azure, so that's what we're targeting. Is there now, or is there going to be a Azure Monitor or specifically application insights connection where it's just automatically got all the open telemetry wired up, where you start out immediately with the application insights dashboard?
So when you spin up an Aspire application inside Azure, we automatically set up monitoring workspaces. In fact, so to deploy an ACA instance, you need a monitoring workspace, and you can layer in application insights on that as well. So we actually have an extension in the hosting model for adding application insights. And so it's quite actually easy to wire it up already. One of the things we do automatically today is we also deploy the Aspire dashboard to ACA as well. So one of the really kind of interesting things about the release of Aspire is that people really latched onto the dashboard as this thing that's super useful. And so people asked if they could use it sort of independent of the Aspire hosting model. And the answer is yes, you can. In fact, you can just download a container image and run it up in your own environment. And so we've got people doing that. But one of the reasons that we're able to do that is that we were working with the ACA team to support hosting the Aspire dashboard inside ACA. So if you just deploy an Aspire application, you'll see in the AZD output that there's a link to the Aspire dashboard. So you click that, you go straight to the Aspire dashboard, and it's giving you that like instant snapshot of telemetry.
Yeah.
And then if you need to go kind of beyond what it can give you, because it's very much point in time, well, then you could go to either Azure Monitor or you could go to Application Insights if you've added that to your application model. So we've got kind of like the grow up options in there for people.
Nice. Well, this is a really exciting release because, for so long, you had a Visual Studio solution, but it was kind of tribal knowledge of, okay, what's in here? Whereas now there's a project to answer the question, what's in here and how does it relate? So, long time coming. I'm so glad you guys did it. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing with us the architecture and how all these things fit together.
Yeah, it's been a really fun project to work on. And so thanks for having me on.
Nice. And of course, .NET 9 is coming out in November.
Yep.
Have you guys just scratched 10% of your roadmap and it's like a whole bunch of things to come, or have you accomplished what you set out to accomplish with Aspire?
We are only just getting started. So we've got big plans. We see Aspire as something that we're going to continue to innovate on. It raises, one of the things that we've talked about internally is it raises the floor for people. Like it allows people to get started quickly and do more interesting things. And that's true for teams within Microsoft as well. We've created a nice platform for other teams to bolt things onto. And so we expect that we'll continue to be adding features and focus on different areas. Like there's teams within Microsoft are coming to us and saying, hey, we'd like to be able to do this on top of Aspire and so on. So we're working with those. Aspire is what we would call a tip product, in that we're trying to keep people using the latest version as much as possible. If you think about the way people use Docker today, they download the latest version of Docker and they keep just rolling forward.
Yeah.
We see that the same way with Aspire as well. We want people to be on the latest version.
Which kind of means the latest version of .NET as well. Yes
and no. So Aspire 9, for example, will likely target .NET 8.
Okay.
So we're cognizant of, particularly in enterprise scenarios, people take a little bit longer to upgrade. Yeah. So we'll target the 8.0 API surface, if that makes sense.
The long-term support release.
Yeah. That's right.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we're trying to be respectful of. We're not trying to turn people's world upside down every single time we push in a release. It's very much trying to keep it additive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, awesome. Well, Mitch, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This is fascinating. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.